The transport ship broke through the atmosphere of Viridian Prime with a shudder that rattled every bolt in its frame, and Captain Derek Stone gripped the armrests of his seat as the vessel descended through layers of purple clouds that seemed to glow with their own inner light, and he wondered for the 1,000th time if she would still be there waiting for him, or if 3 years was too long for anyone to wait, even someone who claimed to love him with the intensity of a supernova. The moon had not changed much from what he could see through the viewport, and the endless forests of crystalline trees still covered most of the surface like a blanket of frozen lightning, and the 3 suns of the Viridian system cast their light in shifting patterns that made the whole world seem like it was breathing and alive in ways that no human colony could ever replicate. Derek had been 28 when he first landed on this moon as part of a survey team sent to evaluate mineral deposits and potential colony sites, and he had been full of ambition and dreams of making his fortune in the vast frontier of space, like so many young explorers before him. But what he found here changed everything. He thought he knew about the universe and about himself. The elves had been a surprise to everyone because humanity had explored hundreds of worlds and found plenty of microbial life and even some simple animals, but never before had they encountered a species that could look them in the eye and speak of philosophy and art and the nature of existence. And the elves of Viridian Prime were not just intelligent, they were ancient, with a civilization that stretched back 10,000 years, and knowledge of sciences that humans were only beginning to understand. Lyra had been assigned as his cultural liaison when the mining company he worked for began negotiations with the Elven Council, and she was the youngest daughter of the ruling family with responsibilities that included making sure the clumsy humans did not accidentally violate any sacred laws or destroy any irreplaceable historical sites, and Derek had thought she would be cold and formal like most diplomats, but instead, she had a curiosity about humans that matched his curiosity about her people. Their first meeting had been in the grand hall of the Crystal Palace where the Elven Council held their gatherings, and Derek had been nervous trying to remember all the proper protocols his company had drilled into him about bowing and formal greetings in the hierarchy of Elven nobility. But then Lyra had walked up to him and stuck out her hand for a handshake like she had seen humans do, and said in slightly accented English that she was pleased to meet him and hoped they could be friends. That simple gesture had broken through all his nervousness, and they had spent the next 6 months working together as the mining negotiations dragged on with both sides, trying to find a compromise that would allow limited resource extraction without destroying the delicate ecosystem of the moon. And during those months, Derek learned that Lyra loved to explore the forest and study the creatures that lived there, and that she had a laugh that sounded like wind chimes, and that she was fascinated by human music, especially the old songs from Earth that Derek would play for her on his portable audio device. He also learned that she was lonely, despite being surrounded by her family and her people, because as the youngest princess she was expected to be perfect and proper at all times, and she rarely got to just be herself without the weight of expectations pressing down on her. And Derek understood that feeling because he had left Earth to escape his own family's expectations that he would take over the family business instead of striking out on his own. They had fallen in love slowly without either of them really noticing, until one day Derek realized that he thought about her every moment they were apart, and that when she smiled at him his whole world seemed brighter. And when he finally worked up the courage to tell her how he felt, she had laughed and said she had been waiting for him to notice for months, and then she kissed him under the light of all 3 suns, and Derek knew he would never want to be anywhere else. But then the mining company had decided they wanted him to return to headquarters to give a full report on the negotiations and to help plan the next phase of operations, and Derek had asked for permission to stay. But his contract was clear, and he had obligations he could not break, and Lyra had told him to go because she understood duty and responsibility better than anyone, but she made him promise to come back to her. That had been 3 years ago, and Derek had kept his promise as best he could, but the company had sent him on assignment after assignment, always promising that the next one would be his last. And finally, he had quit and bought his own passage back to Viridian Prime with every credit he had saved, because no amount of money or career advancement was worth being apart from her any longer. Now, as the transport ship settled onto the landing pad at the small human outpost on the edge of Elven territory, Derek felt his heart pounding with anticipation and fear. Because what if she had moved on? Or what if her family had arranged a marriage for her, as was traditional among elven nobility. Or what, if she was angry that he had taken so long to return? He grabbed his travel bag, which contained everything he owned in the universe, and stepped off the ship into the humid air of Viridian Prime. And immediately, he was hit by the familiar scents of the place, the sweet smell of the crystal flowers and the sharp tang of the mineral-rich soil. And something else, something wild and electric that he had never encountered on any other world. The outpost manager, a gruff woman named Kelly, who had been there since the first human settlement was established, greeted him with a raised eyebrow and a knowing smile. "So you came back," she said. "Well, I hope you know what you are getting yourself into, Stone, because things have changed around here since you left." "What do you mean?" Derek asked, suddenly worried. "The princess, she has been busy," Kelly said. "Your little elf girl is not so little anymore. She has been training with some kind of creatures, dragons they call them, and she has become quite the warrior from what I hear, and the Elven Council has given her some big responsibility, guarding something important in the deep forest." Derek felt a mix of pride and concern, because he had always known Lyra was strong, but he wondered what could have driven her to become a warrior and what she was guarding and why. "Where can I find her?" he asked. Kelly pointed toward the forest. "You will have to go to her. She does not come to the outpost anymore, not since she took up her post at the Guardian Temple, or whatever they call it, about 2 days' walk into the Crystal Forest. Follow the river upstream until you reach the falls and then take the left path. You will know it when you see it." Derek thanked her and set off immediately, because he had already waited 3 years and he was not going to wait another moment. And as he entered the forest, the crystalline trees seemed to recognize him, or perhaps they were just responding to his emotions, because they chimed softly as he passed, and the sound was like a welcome home song that made his eyes sting with unshed tears. He walked for hours following the river as it wound through the forest, and he saw the native wildlife that Lyra had loved to study, the 6-legged deer with their luminescent antlers and the flying serpents that were actually mammals despite their appearance, and the tiny fairies that were not magical at all, but rather a species of highly intelligent insects that lived in complex colonies. As the first sun began to set, and the second sun rose higher, casting orange and purple shadows across the forest floor, Derek heard something that made him freeze in his tracks, because it was a sound he had never heard before. A deep, rhythmic whooshing like massive wings beating the air, and then a roar that shook the trees and sent flocks of birds scattering into the sky. He looked up, and his jaw dropped, because descending from the canopy were 2 creatures that should not exist outside of fantasy stories, and they were dragons. Real, actual dragons with scales that gleamed like polished metal and wings that stretched wider than any ship he had ever flown, and eyes that glowed with an intelligence that was both terrifying and beautiful. The dragons landed in front of him, blocking his path, and Derek stood very still because he did not know if they were here to protect the forest or to eliminate an intruder, and his hand instinctively moved toward the small plasma pistol at his belt, but he knew that would be useless against creatures this size. Then he heard her voice and his heart stopped. "Derek, you may lower your hand from your weapon because Luna and Ember will not harm you unless I command it. And even then I think they would probably refuse because they are very good judges of character, much better than most people I know." Lyra stepped out from between the ancient trees, and Derek felt like someone had punched him in the chest. Because she was different now. Not in a bad way, but in a way that made him realize just how much time had passed, and how much they had both changed. And she wore armor now made from that same crystalline material as the trees, but shaped and molded to fit her form, and it caught the light of the setting suns and threw rainbows across the forest floor. Her silver hair was longer than he remembered, falling past her waist in a braid that was woven with small crystals that chimed softly when she moved, and her violet eyes were the same, but there was something new in them, a depth and confidence that had not been there before. And Derek realized that Kelly had been right when she said Lyra was not the same girl he had left behind. She stopped a few feet away from him, and the dragons, which he now understood were named Luna, and Ember, moved to flank her like guards, or perhaps like friends, and the 3 of them together made a picture that belonged in legends and myths, not in the real world of space travel and mining operations. "I thought you were never coming back," Lyra said, and her voice was steady, but Derek could hear the tremor Underneath the words, the hurt that she had carried for 3 years. "I told you I would return," Derek said, and he took a step forward. But the dragons shifted their weight, and he stopped because he was not sure if they would let him approach. "I promised. You, Lyra, and I always keep my promises even when it takes longer than I want." "Why did it take so long?" she asked, and now the hurt was more visible in her face. 3 years. "Derek, do you know how long that is for my people? We live for centuries, but that does not mean we do not feel every day, every hour of waiting." "The company kept sending me on assignments," Derek said, and he hated how weak the excuse sounded, even though it was true. "They kept promising it would be the last one, and I kept believing them because I needed the money and the experience, but finally I realized that they would never let me go, that I would spend my whole life going from one assignment to another, and I would never see you again. So I quit. I walked away from everything, and I used every credit I had saved to buy passage back here." Lyra studied him for a long moment, and the dragons watched with their glowing eyes, and Derek felt like he was being judged not just by her, but by these ancient creatures who seemed to understand far more than they should. And then Lyra smiled, and it was like the sun breaking through storm clouds. "You quit your job," she said, and there was wonder in her voice. "You gave up your career, your future with the company for me. For us, Derek." "Corrected, I gave it up for us because a future without you is not a future I want." The dragons made a sound that was almost like purring, and Luna, the one with rose gold scales, moved forward and nuzzled Derek with her massive head, nearly knocking him over, and he reached up instinctively to steady himself and found his hand resting on her warm scales, and they felt like smooth stone, heated by the sun. "She likes you," Lyra said, and her smile grew wider. "That is good, because if she did not, I would have had to reconsider everything." Derek laughed because it felt good to laugh after so long, and Lyra laughed too, and suddenly she closed the distance between them and threw her arms around him, and Derek held her tight, breathing in the scent of her hair, which smelled like the forest and something else, something uniquely her, and he realized that this moment right here was what he had been dreaming about for 3 years. "I missed you," he whispered into her hair. "I missed you. Every single day I missed you too," she said, and her voice was muffled against his chest. "But I was also angry at you for leaving, for taking so long to come back. And I spent the first year crying, and the second year training, and the third year guarding. What?" Derek asked, pulling back so he could see her face. "Kelly said you were guarding something important." Lyra took his hand and started leading him deeper into the forest, with the dragons following behind, and Derek noticed that they moved with surprising grace for creatures so large, and they barely made a sound as they glided between the trees. "I am guarding your future," she said. "Our future, actually, after you left the Elven Council, held a special session to discuss the mining negotiations and everything you had done to help us." Derek frowned because he did not remember doing anything special. "I just tried to be fair," he said. "I tried to make sure both sides got what they needed." "Exactly," Lyra said. And that was something none of the other human negotiators had ever done. They all wanted to take as much as possible and give as little as they could. But you actually listened to us. You cared about our forests and our way of life. And you stood up to your own company when they wanted to do things that would have damaged our world irreparably. "I could not let them destroy this place," Derek said. "It is too beautiful, too important." "The council agreed with you," Lyra said, "and they voted to give you a reward. They set aside a portion of our most valuable resource, the luminite that your company wanted so badly, and they decreed that it would be yours to do with as you wished." Derek stopped walking because he could not believe what he was hearing. "The council gave me luminite, but that stuff is worth a fortune. A single container could buy a whole fleet of ships." "They gave you more than a single container," Lyra said quietly. "They gave you enough to make you one of the wealthiest humans in the galaxy, and they asked me to guard it until you returned." "Why you?" Derek asked. "Because I volunteered. She said I told the council that I wanted to be the guardian, that I would wait for you no matter how long it took. And they gave me Luna and Ember as companions and protectors, and I spent 3 years training with them, learning to fight and to survive in the deep forest and to protect what was precious." They walked in silence for a while, and Derek tried to process everything he had just learned, because he had come back to Viridian Prime expecting nothing more than a chance to be with Lyra again. But now he was apparently wealthy beyond his wildest dreams, and the woman he loved had spent 3 years guarding that wealth and waiting for him. "Did you ever think about giving up?" he asked quietly. "Did you ever think about just walking away?" "Every day," she admitted. "But then I would remember the promise you made, and I would think about how you always kept your word even when it was hard. And I decided that if you could be strong enough to keep your promises, then I could be strong enough to wait." Derek squeezed her hand and she squeezed back, and they walked on through the crystal forest as the last light of the day faded and the trees began to glow with their own bioluminescence, and overhead the dragons flew keeping watch, and Derek felt like he had stepped into a fairy tale. Except this was real, and the woman beside him was real, and the future they were walking toward was real. They reached a clearing. As the moons of Viridian Prime began to rise, and in the center of the clearing stood a structure that took Derek's breath away because it was a temple, or perhaps a vault, made entirely of crystal that glowed from within, with a pulsing light that reminded him of a heartbeat, and around the structure were gardens filled with flowers and plants that should not have been able to grow together, but somehow thrived in this magical place. "This is where I have been living," Lyra said. "This is the Guardian Temple, and inside is your fortune. But before we go in, there is something I need to tell you, something I need you to understand." Derek turned to face her fully, and in the light of the glowing temple and the rising moons, she looked like something out of a dream. "Tell me," he said. "I did not guard this fortune just because the council asked me to." Lyra said, "I did it because I needed to prove something to myself and to you." "Prove what?" "That I am not just some princess waiting to be rescued," she said. "That I am strong and capable and worthy of standing beside you as an equal, not as someone you need to protect or take care of, but as a partner who can face anything the universe throws at us." Derek cupped her face in his hands and looked into her eyes. "I never thought you needed rescuing, Lyra. I always knew you were strong, but I am glad you know it too now." Lyra led Derek into the crystal temple, and the moment they crossed the threshold, he felt a change in the air, like stepping into a different world, where the normal rules did not quite apply, and the walls pulsed with soft light that seemed to respond to their presence, growing brighter as they walked deeper into the structure, and the dragons waited outside, standing guard like statues carved from living stone. Inside the temple was larger than it appeared from the outside, and Derek wondered if that was some kind of elven technology or perhaps magic, because he had learned during his first time on Viridian Prime that the line between the two was often blurred when it came to the elven civilization, and they walked through corridors lined with crystalline columns that sang softly when the air moved past them, creating a harmony that was both beautiful and slightly unsettling. The main chamber was at the heart of the temple, and when they entered, Derek stopped in his tracks because the room was filled with containers stacked in neat rows, and each container was made of the same glowing crystal, and through the translucent walls, he could see the luminite inside pulsing with its own internal light that shifted through colors. He had no names for. "This is all mine?" Derek asked, and his voice came out as barely a whisper because he had never seen this much wealth in one place. "All yours," Lyra confirmed. The council was very generous. They said it was payment for the 3 years of negotiations and for your work in helping establish fair trade agreements and for preventing your company from doing irreversible damage to our ecosystem. Derek walked slowly between the rows of containers, running his hand along their smooth surfaces, and he tried to calculate the value of what he was looking at, but the numbers were so large they became meaningless, and he realized that with this much luminite he could do almost anything he wanted. He could start his own company, or buy a fleet of ships, or establish a colony on some distant world, or simply live in luxury for the rest of his life. But as he looked at the fortune surrounding him, he realized that none of those things mattered as much as the woman standing beside him, because what good was wealth if he had no one to share it with? And what was the point of adventure if Lyra was not there to experience it with him? "What do you think I should do with it?" he asked, turning to face her. "That is not for me to decide," Lyra said. "It is your fortune to use as you wish, but I hope whatever you choose to do with it, you will use it wisely." Derek moved closer to her and took both her hands in his. "I want to use it to build something," he said. Something that will benefit. Both our peoples may be a research facility where humans and elves can work together to understand the mysteries of the universe, or maybe a trading hub that will bring our civilizations closer together. Lyra smiled, and her eyes shimmered with unshed tears. Those are worthy goals, she said. But what about us, Derek? What about our future together? That is what I want. Most of all. Derek said, I want us to be together, not just as lovers, but as partners working towards something bigger than ourselves. And I want to do it here on Viridian Prime because this place is special. And because your people need someone who understands both worlds, who can help bridge the gap between human ambition and elven wisdom. And you think you are that person, Lyra? Asked, but there was no challenge in her voice. Only curiosity. I think we are that partnership, Derek corrected. I have the connections in the human worlds, and you have the knowledge of your people, and together we can create something that will last. Long after we are gone, Lyra was quiet for a moment, and Derek could see her thinking, processing everything he had said. And then she nodded slowly. I would like that, she said. But there is something you need to know first. Something that might change your mind about wanting to stay here. What is it? Derek asked, feeling a sudden spike of worry. My family has been very supportive of my role as guardian, Lyra said. But they have also been pressuring me to fulfill my duties as a princess, and that includes making an advantageous marriage alliance with one of the other elven noble houses. Derek felt like someone had poured ice water down his spine. Are you saying you are engaged to someone else? No, Lyra said quickly. I have refused every proposal, but the pressure is not going away, and eventually my family will demand that I choose someone. And if I continue to refuse, there will be consequences. What kind of consequences? I could lose my position in the family. Lyra said I could be exiled or stripped of my titles and responsibilities, and while I do not care much about titles, I do care about being able to work for my people and having a voice in the council. So what are you saying? Derek asked. Are you saying we cannot be together? I am saying that if we are going to be together, we need to do it in a way that satisfies both my family and the traditions of my people. Lyra said, and there is a way, but it will require you to do something that might be difficult. Tell me, Derek said. I will do whatever it takes. You would need to undergo the bonding ceremony, Lyra said. It is an ancient ritual that binds two souls together, not just emotionally, but on a deeper level, and it would make you a part of the elven community. Not fully elven, of course, but recognized as one of us and as my chosen partner. Derek thought about this for a moment because it sounded like a big commitment, and he wondered what exactly the bonding ceremony entailed. But then he looked at Lyra and saw the hope and fear warring in her eyes, and he realized that this was not really a difficult choice at all. I will do it, he said, without hesitation. I will undergo whatever ceremony or ritual is necessary, because I love you, Lyra, and I want to spend the rest of my life with you. Lyra let out a breath she had been holding and threw her arms around him, and Derek held her close, and they stood there in the middle of the crystal chamber, surrounded by enough wealth to buy worlds, but feeling like the only thing that mattered was right there in their arms. The bonding ceremony will not be easy, Lyra warned. It involves both physical and mental trials, and the dragons will be part of it, because they are my guardians, and they need to accept you fully before the bond can be completed. I figured those dragons were more important than they seemed, Derek said with a slight smile. What exactly will I have to do? You will have to prove your strength, your courage, and your worthiness, Lyra said. You will have to face challenges that will test everything you are, and if you fail, the ceremony cannot be completed and we cannot be bonded. And if I succeed, Derek asked, then we will be together in a way that even death cannot separate. Lyra said, our souls will be linked, and we will be able to feel each other's emotions and share each other's thoughts to some degree, and you will gain some of the abilities of my people, including a longer lifespan and enhanced senses. Derek pulled back to look at her. Wait, I will live as long as you do. Not quite as long, Lyra said, because you are human and the bonding can only do so much. But instead of living for 100 years or so, you could live for several centuries, maybe even 1,000 years. If we are lucky. That is a long time, Derek said. But I cannot think of anything I would rather do than spend all that time with you. Then we will begin preparations tomorrow. Lyra said, Tonight we should rest because you have traveled far, and the ceremony will require all your strength. They left the crystal chamber and walked back through the temple, and outside the dragons were waiting. And when they saw Derek and Lyra together, Luna made that purring sound again, and Ember, who had been silent until now, let out a low rumble that sounded almost like approval. Lyra led him to a small dwelling that had been built near the temple, and inside was simple but comfortable, with a bed and a table, and a window that looked out over the forest. And Derek set down his travel bag and realized that this was the first time he had been alone with Lyra in 3 years. We should sleep, Lyra said. But there was hesitation in her voice, like she did not really want to be apart from him, even for the few hours until morning. Or we could talk, Derek suggested. I want to know everything that happened while I was gone, every detail of your training and your life here. Lyra smiled and sat down on the bed, and Derek sat beside her, and they talked long into the night, sharing stories and memories and slowly rebuilding the connection that distance and time had weakened but not broken. And through the window they could see Luna and Ember standing guard, and the crystal forest glowing in the darkness. And Derek felt a sense of peace he had not felt in 3 years. Eventually they both fell asleep sitting up against the wall with their hands clasped together. And when Derek woke in the morning with the light of the 3 suns streaming through the window, he saw Lyra still sleeping beside him, and he knew that he had made the right choice in coming back, because this was where he belonged. Not in some corporate office or on some distant space station, but here on Viridian Prime, with the woman he loved, and the future they would build together. Outside he could hear the dragons moving around, and he wondered what the bonding ceremony would entail, and whether he would be strong enough to pass the trials. But then he looked at Lyra, and felt her hand warm in his, and he knew that he would do whatever it took, because some things were worth fighting for, and some promises were worth keeping no matter what the cost. The morning arrived with the sound of dragon wings beating the air, and Derek woke to find Lyra already dressed in her crystalline armor, standing by the window and watching Luna and Ember circle above the temple in complex patterns that seemed almost like a dance. And when she noticed he was awake, she turned and smiled, but there was nervousness in her eyes. Today we begin the trials, she said. The bonding ceremony has 3 parts, each one designed to test a different aspect of your character and your compatibility with our people and with me. Derek sat up and rubbed the sleep from his eyes. What is the first trial? The trial of strength, Lyra said. But it is not about physical strength alone. It is about the strength of your will and your determination and your ability to endure hardship without breaking. That sounds ominous, Derek said, trying to keep his tone light, but feeling the weight of what lay ahead. It is meant to be challenging, Lyra admitted. But I have faith in you, Derek. Have seen your strength before when you stood up to your company and when you came back here, even though it meant giving up everything you had worked for. They ate a simple breakfast of fruit and bread that Lyra had prepared, and then they walked out to where the dragons were waiting, and Derek noticed that the creatures seemed different this morning, more alert and watchful, as if they understood the significance of what was about to happen. Luna approached Derek and lowered her massive head until her glowing eyes were level with his, and he felt like she was looking into his soul, weighing and measuring everything he was and everything he might become. And then she opened her mouth and breathed out a stream of silver mist that enveloped him completely. Derek felt the mist seep into his skin and fill his lungs, and it was cold at first, but then it began to warm, and he felt a tingling sensation spreading through his entire body. And when the mist cleared, he found that his perception had changed, because everything looked sharper and more vivid, and he could hear sounds that had been too quiet before and smell scents he had never noticed. Luna has given you her blessing, Lyra explained. Now you can perceive the world more like we do, and that will help you in the trials ahead, but it will also make everything more intense, both pain and pleasure. So you must be prepared. Derek nodded and tried to adjust to his enhanced senses, because it was overwhelming at first, like someone had turned up the volume on reality, and he could hear the individual songs of hundreds of birds in the forest and smell the different types of flowers blooming miles away. and see the patterns of energy that flowed through the crystal trees. The first trial will take place in the deep forest. Lyra said there is a place called the Valley of Echoes where sound and light behave strangely, and where your perception will be tested, and you must make your way through the valley alone and reach the shrine at its center without losing yourself to the illusions. What kind of illusions? Derek asked. The valley shows you your fears and your regrets, Lyra said. It takes your memories and twists them into visions that seem real, and many who enter the valley never find their way out because they become lost in their own minds. Derek swallowed hard but nodded. So how do I avoid getting lost? You must remember what is real, Lyra said. Hold on to the truth of who you are and why you are here, and do not let the illusions convince you otherwise. Ember stepped forward, and from her mouth came a small crystal that glowed with warm red light, and Lyra caught it and handed it to Derek. This is a focus crystal, Lyra said. It is tied to my essence, and as long as you hold it, you will be able to feel my presence even when you cannot see me. And that connection might be enough to anchor you when the illusions become overwhelming. Derek took the crystal and felt its warmth spreading through his palm, and he could sense something else too. A faint impression of Lyra's emotions, her concern and her love and her absolute faith that he would succeed. I am ready, he said. They walked for several hours deeper into the crystal forest, following paths that seemed to appear and disappear depending on how the light hit the trees. And Derek noticed that the further they went, the quieter everything became, until even the sound of their footsteps seemed muffled and distant. Finally, they reached the entrance to the Valley of Echoes, and Derek could see why it had that name. Because the valley was filled with strange crystalline formations that caught and reflected sound in weird ways, creating echoes that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, and the light did strange things too, bending and splitting so that everything had multiple shadows that moved independently. This is where I must leave you, Lyra said. You must enter alone and make your way to the shrine. It should take several hours if you walk straight through, but time moves strangely in the valley, so do not be surprised if it feels longer. Derek wanted to kiss her, but something about this moment felt too formal, too ritualistic, so instead, he squeezed her hand and looked into her eyes. I will see you on the other side, he said. I will be waiting. Lyra promised. Derek took a deep breath and stepped into the valley, and immediately everything changed, because the moment he crossed the threshold, the world seemed to shift and warp, and he could no longer see Lyra or the dragons or the forest behind him, and instead he was surrounded by the crystal formations and the strange echoing silence. He started walking forward, clutching the focus crystal and trying to keep his mind clear. But it was hard because his enhanced senses were picking up things that might or might not be real. And he saw movements in the corner of his vision that disappeared when he turned to look, and he heard voices calling his name in tones that ranged from loving to accusing. The first clear illusion appeared after about an hour of walking, and it was his father standing in the middle of the path, looking exactly as he had the last time Derek had seen him 5 years ago, with disappointment written clearly on his face. You threw away everything I built for you, his father said. You could have had a comfortable life running the family business, but instead, you ran off to play explorer, and now look at you chasing after some alien woman and giving up your career for a fantasy that will never work. Derek knew this was not real because his father was back on Earth and probably did not even know where Viridian Prime was, but the words still stung because they echoed his own doubts and fears, and for a moment he almost stopped walking. But then he felt the warmth of the focus crystal in his hand, and he remembered Lyra's faith in him, and he kept walking forward, and when he passed through the illusion of his father, it dissolved into mist. More illusions followed, and each one was designed to hurt him in a different way, and he saw his old colleagues from the mining company telling him he was a fool, and he saw versions of Lyra who laughed at him and said she had never really loved him, and he saw himself old and alone, having wasted his life on a relationship that was doomed from the start. Each illusion was harder to dismiss than the last because they played on his deepest insecurities, but Derek kept walking and kept holding on to the crystal and kept reminding himself why he had come back to Viridian Prime and what he was fighting for. The worst illusion came when he was almost at the shrine, and it showed him a future where he and Lyra were together, but miserable because their differences were too great and their worlds too separate. And he watched this phantom version of himself grow bitter and resentful as the years passed, and he saw Lyra, withdrawing into herself, becoming a shadow of the vibrant woman he loved. This illusion was particularly cruel because it was not obviously false like the others, and Derek found himself standing frozen in the middle of the path, watching this terrible future unfold, and wondering if maybe it was not an illusion at all, but a warning about what would really happen if he went through with the bonding ceremony. He stood there for what felt like hours, wrestling with his doubts and his fears, and the crystal in his hand grew cooler as if Lyra's presence was fading, and Derek felt panic rising in his chest, because maybe he was not strong enough for this. Maybe he should turn back while he still could. But then he remembered something Lyra had said the night before about how she had spent 3 years training and waiting and refusing marriage proposals because she believed in their future together. And he realized that if she could have that much faith in him, then he needed to have that same faith in them. Derek closed his eyes and held the crystal to his chest, and he thought about all the moments they had shared, the laughter and the late-night conversations, and the way she looked at him like he was the most important person in her world, and he thought about the future they could build together. Not the phantom future of the illusion, but the real one filled with challenges and compromises and hard work, but also with love and partnership and purpose. When he opened his eyes, the illusion had faded, and he could see the shrine ahead of him, a simple structure made of white crystal that glowed with pure light, and he walked toward it with renewed determination. And when he finally reached it and placed his hand on its surface, he felt a surge of energy that seemed to wash away all his doubts and fears. The valley around him began to dissolve, and Derek found himself back at the entrance where Lyra was waiting with Luna and Ember, and when she saw him, she ran forward and threw her arms around him. "You did it," she said, and there were tears of joy on her face. "I felt your struggle through the crystal, but you pushed through and you made it." Derek spent the next day recovering from the trial of strength, because even though the physical journey through the Valley of Echoes had not been particularly difficult, the mental and emotional toll had left him exhausted in ways he had never experienced before, and Lyra stayed with him, bringing him food and water and simply sitting beside him while he processed everything he had seen and felt. "The second trial will be different," she told him as they watched the 3 suns set over the crystal forest. "This one is about courage, but not the kind of courage that comes from facing your fears. It is about the courage to be vulnerable, to open yourself completely to another person, and to trust them with the deepest parts of yourself. That sounds harder than the first trial," Derek said it as Lyra admitted. "Many people can face physical danger or overcome their fears, but very few can truly let down all their walls and let someone else see everything they are, including the parts they are ashamed of or afraid to show." The second trial took place at dawn, and this time both Lyra and Derek would participate together, because the bonding ceremony required both of them to be equally vulnerable and equally committed. And the dragons led them to a pool of water that was so clear it looked like liquid crystal, and it was fed by a waterfall that glowed with the same bioluminescence as the trees. "You must enter the pool together," Lyra explained. "And once you are in the water, you will be connected on a deep level, and you will be able to see into each other's minds and hearts, and there will be no secrets, no hidden thoughts, nothing that you can keep from each other." Derek felt a flutter of nervousness because he had thoughts and memories that he was not proud of, and he worried about what Lyra would think when she saw all of him. Not just the good parts, but also the petty jealousies, and the moments of weakness, and the mistakes he had made. Lyra seemed to sense his hesitation, and she took his hand. "I am afraid too," she said. "I have spent my whole life being perfect or trying to be perfect. And the thought of showing you all my flaws and insecurities is terrifying. But this is what the bonding requires: complete honesty and complete acceptance." They removed their clothes and stepped into the pool together, and the water was warm and tingly, like it was charged with some kind of energy, and as they moved deeper, the water rose up to their chests, and then suddenly, Derek felt a rush of sensation that was not his own. He could feel Lyra's emotions as if they were his own, and he felt her nervousness, and her love, and her deep fear that she was not enough, that she would disappoint him somehow. And he also felt her memories, flooding into his mind, and he saw her childhood growing up in the palace, always trying to meet impossibly high standards, and he saw the loneliness she had felt, even surrounded by family, and he saw the moment she first realized she was falling in love with him, and how terrified she had been because she knew it would complicate everything. At the same time, he knew that Lyra was seeing his memories too, and he felt exposed as she witnessed his moments of doubt and his occasional resentment toward his father and the times he had been tempted to give up on coming back to her because it seemed too hard and too complicated. But along with the difficult memories came the good ones too, and Derek saw through Lyra's eyes how much his small gestures of kindness had meant to her and how she had replayed their conversations in her mind during the long years of waiting, and he felt the depth of her commitment to him and her absolute certainty that they were meant to be together. And he hoped she could see in his memories how much he had thought about her during his travels, and how every beautiful sunset or interesting discovery had felt incomplete because she was not there to share it, and how he had finally realized that no amount of career success or adventure was worth being apart from her. The connection deepened, and Derek began to see not just Lyra's memories, but her very essence, the core of who she was beneath all the roles and expectations, and he saw her strength and her compassion and her fierce determination to protect the people and things she loved, and he saw her creativity and her curiosity, and her deep well of patience that had allowed her to wait for him even when it seemed hopeless. And through Lyra's eyes he saw himself in a way he never had before, and he saw that she valued his honesty and his willingness to stand up for what was right, even when it was difficult. And she appreciated his sense of humor and the way he tried to see the best in people. And she loved his stubbornness that had brought him back to her despite every obstacle. The experience was overwhelming and intimate in a way that went far beyond physical intimacy, and Derek felt tears streaming down his face as he realized that this was what true connection meant, not just sharing your life with someone, but sharing your very self. Beside him, Lyra was also crying, and they moved together in the water and embraced, and the connection between them grew even stronger until Derek could not tell where his emotions ended and hers began, and they were simply one being experiencing everything together. Time seemed to stop as they floated in the pool, and gradually the intensity of the connection began to, as though it did not disappear completely, and Derek could still feel Lyra's presence in the back of his mind like a warm light that would never fade. When they finally emerged from the pool, they were both exhausted, but also exhilarated, because they had passed the second trial and now they knew each other in a way that few beings ever did, and there were no more secrets between them. No more walls or defenses, just pure understanding and acceptance. The dragons were waiting, and they made sounds of approval as Derek and Lyra dried off and dressed, and Derek noticed that the bond between him and Lyra remained even outside the pool, and he could sense her emotions and sometimes catch fragments of her thoughts, though not as clearly as when they had been in the water. That was intense, he said, and his voice was hoarse. It only gets more intense from here, Lyra said, but she was smiling. Now comes the third trial, the trial of commitment, and this is when we will be bonded permanently, if the dragons accept you. What does that involve? Derek asked. You will fly with Luna and I will fly with Ember, Lyra said. And we will perform the aerial dance of bonding, which is an ancient ritual that binds three souls together. Yours, mine, and the dragons, and if we succeed, we will be connected for the rest of our lives. Derek looked up at the massive dragons and felt a spike of nervousness. I have never flown on a dragon before, he said. Luna will guide you, Lyra assured him. Trust her, and trust yourself, and remember everything you have already overcome to get here. The dragons lowered themselves to the ground, and Lyra showed Derek how to mount Luna by using the ridges along her back as handholds, and the dragon's scales were warm and smooth under his hands, and he could feel the powerful muscles moving beneath her skin. Lyra mounted Ember with practiced ease, and then both dragons launched themselves into the air with powerful beats of their wings, and Derek held on tight as Luna climbed, higher and higher until the forest below looked like a carpet of glowing stars. At first Derek was terrified, because he had flown in ships before, but this was different because there was no cockpit or safety harness, just him and the dragon and the open sky. But then He felt something shift and he realized that he could sense Luna's emotions just like he could sense Lyra's, and the dragon was calm and confident, and she was gently encouraging him to relax and trust her. Slowly, Derek let go of his fear and began to move with Luna instead of against her, and he learned to lean into the turns and shift his weight to help her maneuver, and it was like learning to dance with a partner who was infinitely patient and skilled. Above him, Lyra and Ember began the aerial dance, and Derek watched in awe as they performed loops and spirals and complex patterns that seemed to paint light across the sky. And then Luna joined in, and Derek found himself part of the dance, moving in harmony with the other dragon and with Lyra. The dance required complete trust and coordination because one wrong move could send them crashing into each other. But Derek found that he did not need to think about what to do because Luna guided him, and he could feel Lyra's presence in his mind showing him the patterns, and he simply let himself flow with the rhythm. They danced for what felt like hours, and gradually Derek became aware of a third presence in his mind, one that was ancient and wise and powerful. And he realized it was the combined consciousness of both dragons, and they were examining him, judging whether he was worthy of bonding with their chosen elf princess. Derek opened himself to their scrutiny, just as he had opened himself to Lyra in the pool, and he let them see everything he was and everything he hoped to become, and he felt their approval wash over him like warm sunlight. The dance reached its climax, and all four of them, Luna and Ember and Lyra and Derek, spiraled together in a complex pattern that ended with them hovering in formation as the three suns rose together on the horizon, and Derek felt a final surge of energy as the bond snapped into place, and suddenly, he was connected, not just to Lyra, but to the dragons as well. They descended slowly, and when they landed, Derek slid off Luna's back and his legs were shaky, but his heart was full because he had done it. He had passed all three trials, and now he and Lyra were bonded in a way that transcended normal relationships. Lyra ran to him and they embraced, and Derek could feel her joy and relief flooding through their bond, and he knew she could feel his emotions too, and it was perfect.